Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, today's video came recommended, and the kind of title and topic of it I thought was really fascinating because the title is Failed Constitutional Amendments. So we hear about the actual amendments, but what has been attempted to go in and has failed. Now, this video comes from a channel that I hope I'm saying this right, is titled ZXCGORB. ZXCGORB? Also want to take the opportunity with this to promote a smaller channel. This channel currently has 3,500 subs, so it's probably pretty new. Now this video though is a month old and has over 200,000 views. So something must be right here. So the video is going to be linked down below. Let's make sure we're supporting this channel so we can help it grow. And with that, let's check this out. All right. Hello, America.
Every now and again, America decides it wants to change its constitution.
True.
However, passing an amendment is very difficult, as was intended by the Founding Fathers. 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate must support an amendment, after which 3/4 of the states must ratify the amendment for it to be officially adopted.
By the way, just based on those requirements alone, that makes amendments like nearly impossible to pass. I mean, it's so hard to get something bipartisan enough that 2/3 plus a ratification process could happen. It's got to be a big deal.
Alternatively, amendments can be ratified if 2/3 of the states call for an Article 5 convention, named after the section of the Constitution that says how to amend it, and 3/4 of the states ratify an amendment from the convention, though this method has never been used successfully.
3/4 is so much. You guys like that? Do you think it should be really hard to amend the Constitution? Should be that hard? That 2/3 thing? Do you think, by the way, laws just that pass through Congress should be like that? You know, a lot of things just require majority vote, so it's, 50.1%. What do you guys overall think of what it takes to pass a law? Different types of law, constitutional amendments or just national laws. What do you think about the current system with that? Let me know down below.
Either way, the strict requirements for amending the Constitution ensure that very few proposals are ever ratified. Ever since the Constitution itself was ratified in 1788, there have been around 12,000 proposed amendments. But
I did not know it was that high.
Just 27 of them have been adopted. So what were those failed amendments, and why were they unsuccessful?
Let's go over all right, this is going to be a long video. Let's go over all 12,000 of them. Here we go. I'm going to write them down. Quick quiz at the end of the video.
Perhaps the most successful unsuccessful amendment was the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have guaranteed legal equality regardless of sex. After first being proposed in 1971, the ERA was supported by multiple presidents and both the Democratic and Republican parties, and it was passed by Congress by a wide margin in 1972. However, only 35 of the necessary 38 states ratified it within the 7-year time frame allotted by Congress, killing the ERA.
Now, I mean, the ERA does get passed in other ways, maybe not in the Constitution, but yeah, part of the civil rights, era. So going from this, really, I mean, the civil rights movement really starts in the 50s and really after World War II, and then picks up obviously in the 60s with things like the Civil Rights Act, 64, and then kept going through the 60s. ERA kind of being one of the, I feel like, last of that wave of big like civil rights legislation. But yeah, it does come back in another form though, just not in an amendment. Wasted.
Considering
GTA.
everything it had going for it, how did the ERA not pass? Anti-feminists, led by conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly, mobilized against the amendment because it would have destroyed traditional gender roles by ending women's exclusion from the draft, eliminating women's preferable status in alimony and child custody cases, and removing protections for working women. They successfully swayed public opinion against the ERA in enough states to prevent its passage, and the election of ERA opponent Ronald Reagan in 1980 solidified the public's opposition.
Interesting how you get that. And some of those arguments, traditional family values have always been kind of an umbrella term that people use and interpret it the way that they want. But then, getting into the individual problems, I guess, that you're saying of the ERA, marketing it that way for people to, I guess, not want to see it get passed in that way, or at least have it redone. And that's what happens usually in Congress. What can happen is, a law gets shot down, people want to see it revised, that kind of thing, and then it can come back. Sometimes it fails right there. But similar, it kind of reminded me right there of the arguments that were made for people that were anti-women's suffrage, say about 1919, 1918, 1919, after World War I, when that became a big push to get women the right to vote. And there was that same thing that it would erode family values, and specifically it would, change the role of women, and that women would, start to get involved more in politics and thereby neglect their motherly and wifely duties at home, that kind of thing. You hear that whatever version of what a woman's role is supposed to be at any given time, you'll hear those brought up. It looks like in arguments that have to do with any kind of civil rights.
Interest in the ERA was revived during the 2010s, culminating in 3 more states ratifying the amendment. However,
30 years later,
since 6 states had also withdrawn their support, and since the 3 states ratified the amendment after the time frame established by Congress, the Equal Rights Amendment will be remembered by history as a failure. The most recent amendment to be passed by Congress was the District of Columbia Voting
But yeah, like we said, a lot of the elements of that are going to get passed later on in different forms.
Rights Amendment. Passed by Congress
DC
was the District of Columbia Voting Rights Amendment, proposed in 1978. Had it been ratified, the amendment would have basically turned Washington, D.C. into a state without officially granting it statehood, by giving it representation in Congress, full participation in presidential elections, and the ability to ratify amendments.
I've heard this a lot. This happened a lot of time. I mean, Washington, D.C., yeah, it's a city, but it's a huge city. It has a higher population than some states, right? So getting a representative, people have always wondered. Kind of interesting how that goes down. Why was Washington, D.C., and you can think about it, ever not included as part of a state, whether it was Maryland or Virginia, just to keep, I guess, the capital supposed to be kind of a, I don't want to say politically neutral place, but that was kind of the approach.
However, the amendment was only ratified by 16 states because it was opposed by many conservatives, probably because D.C. would have almost certainly elected a bunch of progressive Democrats to Congress.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why it very much votes blue in elections. So yeah, you'll never see this get passed unless someone figures out a loophole.
Like the ERA, Congress gave the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment a certain amount of time to be ratified, and when this time ran out in 1985, it officially became a failure.
RIP.
Even though the amendment died back in the 80s, its legacy has survived into the present in the form of the District of Columbia statehood movement, which, shockingly, advocates turning D.C. into a state outright.
Wonder what the borders would be, or the overall size. Would it even, if they redistrict it, I don't know the exact size that is considered Washington, D.C. Would you take land and add it? Could it ever be as big as our next smallest state, Rhode Island?
Though the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment was the last amendment to be passed by Congress, a few others have come close, such as the Balanced Budget Amendment, which would prevent Congress from spending more money than the government makes in income.
That seems so sensible, doesn't it? Pass more. Yeah, that never happens. You got to spend money to make money, right? You can go into debt. It's like an investment.
There have been many attempts to pass a balanced budget amendment, like in 1982 under President Ronald Reagan. Remember him from earlier?
There's been very few times that we've ever had a fully balanced budget. Is the last time, I think, the 90s?
But the most successful attempt was in 1995. A year earlier, during the 1994 midterm elections, Republicans made massive gains, capturing control of both chambers of Congress for the first time since 1952, amidst what we now call the Republican Revolution. Passing a balanced budget amendment had been a major campaign promise in 1994, so Republican officials now look to deliver. In order to overcome the two-thirds threshold for constitutional amendments, Republicans allied with conservative Democrats, and although this alliance successfully...
Yes, there are such things, conservative Democrats, if you didn't know. Not as cut and dry as you think.
...successfully passed a balanced budget amendment through the House, it came up one vote short in the Senate. Considering that most states have a balanced budget provision in their constitutions, and considering the gains Republicans made at the statewide level in 1994, it is reasonable to believe that the amendment could have been ratified had it passed Congress. Most Democrats, including President Bill Clinton,
I think it would be even less likely to pass now. Even less likely now.
Clinton opposed a balanced budget amendment because of their leniency towards deficit spending and concerns about the amendment's effect on social programs like Social Security. but there were many exceptions. Although a balanced budget amendment hasn't even come close to passing since the 90s, the amendment still has some residual support and is one of the most likely amendments to be added to the Constitution in the future.
Yeah, because it doesn't seem as partisan as maybe some of the other things you might find, like the DC thing. Makes sense.
Another amendment that still receives support today is a Congressional Term Limits Amendment, which, as you might have guessed, would impose a limit on the number of terms members of Congress can serve.
This is something, again, you hear on both sides for sure. Yeah, let's see how close this actually came, though.
A variety of different term limit amendments have been proposed, but the most successful iteration was voted on after the Republican Revolution in 1994. Several states had passed term limit laws for members of Congress, but they were all struck down by the Supreme Court's decision in U.S. Term Limits, Inc. v. Thornton, prompting many Republicans
Supreme Court got in
and
on
some
that one.
Democrats to call for a term limit amendment. A proposal was voted on by the House, and although it received a majority of the votes, it did not reach a two-thirds majority, killing the amendment. The amendment's detractors argued that term limits would prevent politicians from accumulating knowledge and experience, and that people can already vote politicians out of office if they don't like them. On the other hand,
I've heard this argument when I talk with people from countries outside the United States. You know, there are a lot of countries, excuse me, that don't have like presidential term limits like we do in the United States. And I always ask, like, what do you think about that? And a lot of them don't necessarily say, like, that I've talked to say it's a bad idea for that same reason he just said, which was, hey, if they're doing good, then let them stay, right? And if they're doing poorly, we have a system that can vote them out. And it's like, I guess, a fairly tight argument that way, but you know, people could fear that can just lead to somebody trying to, you know, change the system and overthrow that whole system just to become like a dictator or something. That's usually what I hear from like the American perspective. What do you think about all these, by the way? All these that are coming through. Let me know down below. You know, maybe do something for each amendment that gets through this video and say just real quick if you think it should get passed or should not. I'd love to hear what you guys say.
And supporters of the amendment claimed it would allow new people and new ideas to enter Congress while also reducing corruption. While it's fairly unlikely that Congress would vote to establish term limits on itself, congressional term limits are extremely popular amongst the public, and a term limit amendment could very well be a future amendment to the Constitution.
And by the way, one of the rebuttals I've heard too was, you know, as for like the American perspective of why we should have term limits is even if that person was good, their ideas can live through another candidate that is, you know, like a clone of them, a carbon copy, pretty much. So that just because someone was doing well doesn't mean their ideas are going to leave with them when they leave office.
Let's jump back in time. During the early 1860s, the
Civil
United
War?
States was deeply divided over the issue of slavery, so much so that a civil war seemed inevitable. However, there were a few last-ditch attempts to prevent violence by crafting an acceptable compromise. Many compromise proposals
They had it for a while. Which was when you admit a state, you got to basically admit two states and have one free state and one slave state. And that worked for a long time. But then with Western expansion, it really made that thing difficult, especially as the abolitionist movement started to gain steam.
The Constitution, such as the Crittenden Compromise, named after Senator John J. Crittenden, which actually called for 6 amendments.
When I taught U.S. history.
Although the Crittenden Compromise never gained much traction, one compromise amendment did come fairly close to ratification, the Corwin Amendment. Named after Congressman Thomas Corwin, his amendment would have prohibited any future amendment from empowering Congress to abolish or interfere with any state's domestic institutions. Slavery. He was talking about slavery.
Yeah. Say it without saying it, right? States' rights.
Congress passed the amendment. President James Buchanan supported it, and a few states ended up ratifying it. It even received some support from the great emancipator himself, Abraham Lincoln. Even so, the North and South had grown so polarized that another compromise over slavery was practically impossible. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 basically killed any hope for a peaceful reconciliation, and as the war dragged on, support for finally abolishing slavery grew, leading to the successful 13th Amendment.
Abolition of slavery. You know, these are the things that I hear when I talk to people about presidents. and like worse presidents. One of the ones I hear a lot is Buchanan for stuff like that.
A century later, during the late 1960s,
I thought that was my
the United
screen.
States was deeply divided over issues like civil rights
Civil
and
Rights
the
Act.
Vietnam War. This was reflected in the contentious election of 1968, with the Republican candidate Richard Nixon narrowly defeating Democrat.
Yeah, one of the last elections where you had actually a significant third candidate happening there, which in the end is just divided votes. It just takes votes away. So people don't really like to go third party now because they believe it's just taking away votes from the lesser of two evils.
Democrat Hubert Humphrey by less than 1% of the popular vote. However, the Electoral College was heavily tilted towards Nixon and did not accurately reflect the closeness of the election.
Yep.
The election was further
Problems with
complicated
the
by the
Electoral
third-party
College, right?
candidacy of George Wallace, who sought to get enough electoral votes to prevent any candidate from securing the necessary majority, thus allowing him to use his influence to choose the winner.
Yeah.
Although this
I've heard of that too. It reminds me of in 2016 with a candidate named Evan McMullen. If you heard of him, he came out of Utah, and he was coming in and joined the presidential race. And he said, because, you know, it was supposed to be for those that really didn't like the two candidates between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and that he didn't expect to get elected, but was hoping that with like if he did get voted in at least some states, that it could throw the decision back to Congress, and then it could get you know, talked about more and maybe get a chance there, like revive his chance or something like that. But anyway, we haven't seen those efforts work.
This plan became pointless when Nixon won the election outright. Many people became concerned that the Electoral College was undemocratic. To resolve this issue, the Bay-Seller Amendment was proposed in 1969 by Senator Birch Bayh.
All right, cue Mr. Beat here. I know he hates the Electoral College. Somebody get him in here about this. I want to hear his thoughts on this.
And Congressman Emanuel Seller. The amendment would have abolished the Electoral College and replaced it with a national popular vote, in which the candidate who received the most votes won the election, unless they got less than 40% of the vote, in which case the top two vote-getting candidates would advance to a runoff election. With bipartisan support, broad support from the public, and the backing of President Richard Nixon,
Not gonna happen
the amendment
anymore.
passed the House by a wide margin. However, it was filibustered in the Senate by Southerners and conservatives from small states who benefited disproportionately from the Electoral College.
Yeah, and there's multiple things going for it here. The whole states thing, big states versus little states. But now I think, because if this is back in the Nixon era, it wouldn't get nearly as much probably not nearly as much of bipartisan support anymore, because the last two Republicans that have won presidential election, George Bush Jr. and Donald Trump, both won their first elections without the popular vote. They won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. More people voted for Al Gore and Hillary Clinton, and so it could disproportionately, it looks like these days, affect Republicans potentially. I mean, just potentially. And I think that might hurt the bipartisanship of this. At least that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Without enough support to break the filibuster, the Bay-Seller Amendment was defeated. Although most Americans and many politicians, especially Democrats, still support abolishing the Electoral College, Bay-Seller represents the high watermark of the movement.
Yeah.
A lot of
Those are great
amendments
stories
end
thus
up
far. I'm
failing
really
in the
liking
Senate,
this.
but one amendment proposed in 1911 would have taken care of this issue.
1811, got to think context here. Pre-World War I, Second Industrial Revolution. It's got to do with business. What's going on here?
The Senate. At the time, senators were elected by state legislatures rather than directly by the people,
Oh, that's right.
which many progressives saw as undemocratic and conducive towards corruption. To fix this, progressive politicians pushed for amending the Constitution to require the direct election of senators. However, a socialist congressman named Victor L. Berger believed the direct election amendment didn't go far enough, and instead proposed an amendment that would outright abolish the Senate, which he saw as obstructive towards progress. Furthermore,
good luck with
Berger's
that,
amendment
Berger.
would have protected legislation passed by Congress from presidential vetoes and judicial review, while also allowing the public to subject legislation to referendums. Most
So he wants to become a direct democracy, have no middle ground anywhere. And basically, go from a republic to a Athenian direct democracy there. And Congress is not going to let that. Can you imagine basically an amendment or whatever that congressmen would vote to abolish themselves? Yeah.
politicians viewed Berger's proposal as radical, and it was never voted on. But since all amendments have to be passed by 2/3 of the Senate, it's safe to assume it never had a chance.
What was the vote?
The amendment requiring the direct election of senators was later ratified in 1913, becoming the 17th Amendment, while Berger's amendment was forgotten.
Yeah.
Another forgotten failed amendment is the Ludlow Amendment,
That was
championed by
story,
Congressman Lewis Ludlow. Ludlow introduced the amendment to Congress many times between 1935 and 1940. If passed, it would have required a national referendum for every declaration of war, unless the United States was attacked first. Ludlow believed that the American people deserved a say in whether or not they were sent to fight and potentially die in a war.
Make it direct. That was actually one of the first famous instances where like a direct democracy in Athens actually took place, was for Athenians to vote if they should go to war with the Persians or basically make a deal with them, and voted to go to war. So yeah, there's a historical precedent for this.
And his logic resonated with the public, with polls showing a large majority of Americans supported his proposal. Despite this,
I want to ask you guys, do you think if it went directly to the population, do you think we would have had far less involvement in wars? I would think so, because, you know, when you're voting yourself, you're voting literally if you are willing to go to the war or not, right? To go to a war. That's what I think. What do you think?
the amendment was opposed by many politicians, including President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who feared it would inhibit America's foreign policy too much. Support for the amendment grew after the USS Panay was sunk off the coast of China by the Japanese Air Force, even though Japan and the US weren't at war with each other, because many Americans feared being dragged into a war.
Right.
The House voted on the amendment in 1938, where it was soundly defeated. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the ensuing outrage caused the Ludlow Amendment to fall out of favor and into obscurity. Lastly, I'd like to introduce to you what might just be the goofiest failed amendment, which was proposed by the otherwise unremarkable Congressman Lucas Miller in 1893.
I love it. Let's hear some goofiness.
Miller believed that countries would join the United States until one day the whole world would be part of the U.S. In preparation for this, he proposed...
That's this American delusion right there, is it not? Just total delusion. Everybody wants to be us. They hate us because they ain't us.
Renaming the United States of America to the United States of Earth. Unfortunately for Miller, Congress didn't take this proposal very seriously. Miller's amendment would have also abolished the Army and the Navy, and it would have required every law to have the continuous support of a majority of the people.
Imagine a direct democracy of 8 billion people on Earth today. Nothing could ever get done. We'd spend our whole lives just voting. We wouldn't be able to have jobs or anything like that. It'd be chaos. Absolute chaos.
Supposedly, Miller only introduced this amendment at the request of his constituents, so it's possible that this amendment was not his own idea. When the Founding Fathers drafted the Constitution, they intentionally made it difficult to change, thus ensuring that only the most important and popular amendments could become a part of America's foundational document. But what if it's just a little too difficult? Maybe the bar is set a little too high. Of all the thousands of failed amendments, there's certainly at least a few which deserved to succeed. But the strict requirements mean America's Constitution rarely changes, and in the current state of partisan gridlock in Congress, an amendment passing in the near future is extraordinarily unlikely.
Yeah.
Many people advocate...
We're probably more bipartisan than we've ever been right now. The parties used to be a lot closer.
Lowering the requirements to amend the Constitution, though this would require an amendment in and of itself. Others advocate calling an Article 5 convention, a proposal which has received support from several states. Maybe an amendment will...
Did you see this?
A proposal...
19 have signed. Change.org. Maybe it's different now, but yeah, 19.
which has received support from several.
I mean, you got to get 34 because it's, you know, you got to get the numbers. But I like this. I like this. This graphic here. This was good.
States. Maybe an amendment will be ratified someday not so far away from now, but until that day, we will only keep adding to the long list of failed constitutional amendments.
Fantastic. Great video. Let's talk about it. All right, fantastic video again from a new channel that I haven't seen before. ZXC Gorb. I don't know how I'm supposed to say that. But yeah, great job with this video. So this was great. This was really cool stuff to look at and to see like how close maybe some amendments have been, because so many of these I've heard argued, you know, continually today, even though, you know, all these got shut down, they've still been, you know, really talked about a lot. So I want to know from you all, which of the amendments that he went over do you think should get passed? I'd love to know what you got. He put about 8 or 9 or so up there. Yeah, which ones do you think should be passed? Also, which of them do you think would be most likely to get passed and then least likely to get passed? Maybe not counting like that last one, you know, the United States of the world, which is pretty drastic, but like of the other ones, I really would like to know what you guys think. Get a good conversation going down below. Again, good job to this channel. I'm happy to be able to promote them to you all, so definitely check that out. Video link again is down below, so you can give the support there. All right, with that, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.